The years before World War II were a time of big change in Japan. The country was becoming modern and industrial very quickly. Nationalism, or strong pride in one's country, was growing. Japan felt squeezed by its large population and the fact that it didn't have many natural resources like oil or minerals. Expanding into other parts of Asia seemed like the solution. This desire to expand led to conflict. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. Then in 1937, a major war with China began. To keep its military going, Japan needed more soldiers. The answer was the draft, also known as conscription. Throughout the 1930s, Japan passed laws that made more and more men eligible for military service. Some people thought serving in the military was a patriotic duty, a way to show love for their country. Others, especially families in rural areas, were afraid of losing their sons in the war with China. Even though some people disagreed, the Japanese government continued with its plans to expand its territory. The country was headed for war. The draft would soon change Japan into a country focused on its military. Like and subscribe to MGoTV 360 History for more stories. Japan's first draft laws from the late 1800s were designed to create a modern professional army. But the growing war in China needed more soldiers. So, in the 1930s, the government passed new laws. These laws meant that not just young men, but also older men, students, and even some workers could be drafted. This was a big change. Japan was shifting from a small draft to a system where everyone could be called to serve. As the war in China continued, the need for soldiers grew. The Japanese government made the rules about the draft even stricter. It became harder to avoid being drafted. Families felt pressure to tell their sons to join the military. The government used propaganda, which are messages designed to influence people. It made military service sound glorious and said the war was a fight to free Asia. Many people believed these messages, and a wave of patriotism swept across the country. Japan's military, powered by the draft, won some big victories early in the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 brought the United States into the war. A fierce war followed across the Pacific Ocean. From the jungles of Southeast Asia to faraway Pacific islands, Japanese soldiers, many of them drafted, fought hard, but they faced a very strong enemy in the United States. America's factories and strong will started to turn things around. As the war went on, it became clear how terrible the cost was in human lives. More and more Japanese soldiers were killed. The once mighty Japanese army started losing battles. The government kept telling everyone they would win, but that couldn't last. The reality of what was happening was very different. By 1944, Japan was in deep trouble. The war was not going well. The Japanese army, once thought to be unbeatable, was now fighting to defend itself. They desperately needed more soldiers. The government, trying to get more people into the military, took extreme measures. Older men, teenagers, and even young boys, many with little or no training, were forced to join the army. These poorly equipped and untrained recruits were sent into extremely dangerous battles. One of the saddest parts of this time was the creation of the kamikaze units. Wanting to cause as much damage as possible to the American ships, the Japanese military started using suicide attacks. Young men, some barely old enough to shave, were given basic training and then sent on missions where they knew they would die by crashing their planes into enemy ships. These kamikaze pilots, driven by a sense of duty and love for their country, became a symbol of Japan's desperation near the end of the war. Japan's surrender in 1945 marked the end of a very difficult time. The country was in ruins and its people were tired and hurt. The war and the draft had a huge impact on Japanese society. Millions of people had died. Families were broken apart. The terrible things that happened during the war, especially the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, left deep emotional scars. After the war, Japan chose a new path. The country decided it would never fight a war again and became a peaceful nation. The new constitution, written in 1947, made this official in Article 9. Which said Japan would not use war to solve problems. This decision was heavily influenced by the horrors of World War II and the suffering of the Japanese people. The memory of the draft and the war still affects Japan today. It reminds people of the terrible cost of war and how important peace is. Like and subscribe to MGO TV 360 History for more stories.